As you can see, this section is on the microeconomic model of money laundering. It's adapted from the source you can see on the screen. It is only in their third edition. As far as I can see, it hasn't gone through a journal, and therefore it hasn't received a proper review. So we can take this simply as a description. It is not a widely accepted model, but it's useful for our purposes because it breaks down the elements of money laundering and enables you to give some structure to what you're writing about and compare the various elements of the process. So it is useful for us. We can see it as a two-stage process. First of all, the decision as to whether to engage in money laundering or not, and then the decisions that are taken in the money laundering process, and that is going to be related to the risk of being caught, the returns they're going to get, and the amount of trouble they're going to take to conceal the crime. These elements, as you might expect, have certain trade-offs related to them. The return from the activity is in part related to the risk being the probability of being caught and things like that. But we're going to be a little bit more specific in a moment. And then they have to decide on the degree of confidentiality that they're going to, in effect, purchase. To what extent are they going to try to conceal their crime? How sophisticated should their money laundering activities actually be? Putting these together loosely, we have a utility function, which I should stress is the criminal's utility function, and which is perhaps a little bit unusual, but we just want to understand the criminal's position in this model. So the benefit that the criminal gets from the activity is going to be a function of the expected profits, the risk that is being undertaken, and the degree of confidentiality that the criminal decides to purchase. The higher the confidentiality, the lower the risk. So the point being made here is that effectively we can substitute the risk with the as a function of confidentiality, and that this is a negative relationship. So the higher the confidentiality, the lower the risk. So we've got eventually a trade-off between the amount of confidentiality that the criminal decides to purchase and the expected return. And here we extend the notion of confidentiality with the idea of the probability of securing legality. So we shall see the relationship between those two in a moment. We're going to look at the confidentiality as being a function of the price of confidentiality and the degree of confidentiality that we take. So down here it notes that confidentiality is assumed to be between 0 and 1. So you can look on it as a kind of index, if you like. And then the price is the price per 0.1 increase in the index. So this amounts to a cost of confidentiality, and that is the extent to which the criminal is going to try to conceal their ill-gotten gains, which is denoted as W0, subscript 0. So those are the proceeds of illegal laundering. W, therefore, is the net amount. It's the proceeds minus the cost of the laundering process, and we've looked at that elsewhere, the smurfing and the loans and that sort of thing. So all those come at a cost, and we've got to include it in our model because clearly the criminal is going to be having to decide what kind of concealment he wants. So the expected profits is going to be a function of these of W, which we can see on the right hand side. We could substitute this for W, but we're using W as the net returns from the gains from the money laundering rather. And this is well, they split it in the returns as to investment. In other words, they're kind of thinking of the idea of you're investing in property and your profits are the returns from that property. It's a little bit of an unnecessary division, I think. We could just see it as W. I don't know what they do with their money laundered money, but once it's legal, perhaps they just spend it and consume it rather than invest it. So it's a little bit of a over analyzing the position, I think. Anyway, we introduce rho here, and rho is the probability that the funds of securing legality, right? So we have the probability of securing legality times this which is the benefits of money laundering net of the confidentiality purchased. And added to that is the probability of not obtaining legality and times K, which is the punishment, because if they've not obtained legality, they've been discovered as being illegal and therefore are punished. So this is going to be negative, as it notes down here. K as the cost of the potential penalty has got to be negatives. So these are the benefits and this is the penalty. This is the probability of the benefits, and this is what happens if you don't manage to obtain legality. So the net of these two is the expected profit from money laundering. Then finally, the probability of securing legality is unsurprisingly linked to the amount of confidentiality you purchase, and this is saying that the relationship is positive, so that the more confidentiality you purchase, the greater the probability of obtaining legality. These two further assumptions, this one simply stating that the probability of obtaining legality varies between 0 and 1, so 0.5 is 50-50 chance, and so on. And then this assumption is saying that the more probability, the higher the probability of legality, the higher the consumption, which we've confidentiality, which we've said before, but that the rate of change decreases, so that the increase in confidentiality that you purchase increases your probability of legality, but at a decreasing rate. So diminishing marginal returns to C, for those familiar with the language of economics. So these are just making those points, and then it suggests that there are three outcomes. If the expected return on funds increases, which we said is a little bit of an over-refinement, then clearly your returns here on this increase, and you're going to purchase more confidentiality because the profitability of the activity has increased. If the punishment increases, then the whole of the returns for any given level of confidentiality will decrease. And then if the price of confidentiality increases, then it says that there's going also to be a decrease in the amount of confidentiality purchased because it's becoming more expensive and not worth the extra return that you get from confidentiality. So some quite common sense conclusions there, which is reassuring, but it's just kind of mapped out the problem of money laundering in what I hope is a useful way. One way of looking at the model is to see what the policy implications are, which is the value of the model in many ways. So we can increase the punishment at K. As you can see in the model, that puts a simple negative value on the expected profitability. So what can we say about increasing the punishment? Well, first of all, it's a cheap policy. It's easy to pass in law. You just say, maximum sentence, or you can sentence people up to 30 years or something like that, which is clearly going to have possibly some deterrent effect, but it may simply result in the money launderer purchasing more confidentiality, and it just increases the return to confidentiality. So kind of produces a rather unholy race between the two. And then if you're punishing point B, if you're punishing the money laundering process, then clearly you have to find banks, and if you look up money laundering, you'll soon find the names of banks coming up having to pay huge fines. Penalizing banks in this way is problematic. Sometimes they say, well, we should just go for the directors rather than the bank itself, because it's problematic because governments act as kind of backstop saviors of banks, and here they are punishing the banks. So they mustn't punish them too much, otherwise they're going to cause problems for their other role, which is saving the banks. So it has some conflicts there. And then point C, identifying the people involved is difficult. So increasing the punishment may sound like a simple option, but really when you think about it, its practical application, you can see that it isn't going to be quite as easy. So how can we increase the price of confidentiality there? And we can see its role in the model as a whole. It makes confidentiality more expensive, and that reduces the returns to the criminal. How do we do this is difficult. The suggestion here that I make is simply making transactions more transparent. Having a more computerized system, that sort of thing, isn't going to present problems for the criminal. So it can do that, but the problem with that is that you're creating a cost for everyone else, as it says in point B there, a potential cost for all legal transactions. And that is something to take into account. So they kind of want to increase the cost of confidentiality, but not increase the cost overall. So one response of government is to insist on special posts within banks of people whose responsibility is to trace money laundering, and they have a certain independence of the bank. They sit in the bank, and you can't start leaning on them and saying, oh, well, I'm sure it's all right. I'll see you have a holiday in a nice part of the world. They can't do that sort of thing. So it's got some independence, and that kind of gets round to trying to impose a cost on everyone. But you can think of the future, maybe in a highly computerized environment, then maybe a computer program can be looking for suspicious transactions. in much the same way as, say, the stock market looks for suspicious movements of share prices. So maybe something like that for the future, but for the moment, it has quite a heavy cost implication, and it is difficult to effectively increase the price of confidentiality. After all, with the banks, whose names I will spare, but they're up there on the internet, they clearly had all the paraphernalia of money laundering in place, and for some mysterious reason, it didn't work. Then our third one is decrease in the probability of achieving legality, which is kind of similar, but it's a little bit more legal orientated. Under that heading, I can think of closing down tax havens, which would be quite useful, making the countries with obvious legal loopholes, with a weak legislature, as it says there, making them have to comply with higher legal standards or suffer isolation. So it is remarkable that these places are clearly indicated in any YouTube clip. If you want to have your money untraceable, go to this country or to this state in America. And it's just very surprising that central governments don't do anything about it. So there's a kind of nod towards accepting a level of money laundering. So you wonder how serious governments are in trying to control this illegal activity. And it kind of leads into the literature that we mentioned, in particular the Alexander reading, that talks about what are the advantages for countries of money laundering, not only countries with a weak legislature, but other countries as well, that perhaps not pursuing it with quite the energy that one might expect. And then finally, to decrease the probability of achieving legality, retrospective legislation. This is not a popular thing. The assumption with any law is that it applies from now onwards, but retrospective legislation does exist, and what it is that you pass a law and you apply it to time before the law was passed on actions that are now illegal, but at the time they were undertaken, they're legal. So it means that somebody who thinks that they've got a clever scheme for money laundering that is, in inverted commas, legal, but is clearly not it's clearly in the spirit of money laundering, those people can be prosecuted later on. So merely knowing that something is you're assured by your accountant that this is legal doesn't mean to say that you're not going to be prosecuted later on. So it introduces this element of uncertainty, and it's something that happens with tax on a regular basis, that the government makes a scheme that was legal at the time, goes back and makes it illegal, because it was obviously counter to the spirit of paying the taxes we owe. So that's our look at maximising the utility of the criminal, and I hope it's provided some insight into the activity and problems created by money laundering.